There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod, and for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some moles. We have another incredible author that's here with Stephen and I, and he had the pleasure of reaching out to us, and we've been working with Mountaineers Books. The book is titled The Wanderer, An Alaska Wolf's Final Journey. It's by Tom Walker. He is coming to us from Alaska. Tom, it's a pleasure to meet you, and it was incredible to read your book. How's everything going with you?
Good. We're having a very late spring. It's cold still. It's in the 40s, very windy, overcast. The snow was pretty deep, not as bad as last winter, but it's slow to go off. And as soon as we're finished with the podcast, I'm running up to the Yukon River. It's a drive from here because there's a lot of ice flow, big floods, and I want to see the record breakup.
Nice. That's awesome. And you talk about some of that stuff in the book, it's fascinating just getting a visual of that ice breakup. You've been in Alaska for, now you say, over 60 years.
Almost 60
years. Almost 60, yeah. What's it been like for you living there, growing up there, or like your passion for wildlife and photography and writing seems to have started, young in life. So how has that really impacted all of the work that you've done in the course of time that you've been there?
I think the longevity has given me a view of how the state has changed and how the resources changed and how the natural resources that the living resources depend on for survival. We have, over the years, we had variations in wildlife populations that you see, and they're fairly remarkable if you look at the peaks and valleys in the populations. One time there were 500,000 caribou in the Western Arctic caribou herd, and that's about half of that now. And the Eastern Arctic caribou herd, which is called the Porcupine caribou herd, which is named after the river, is about twice what it was 10 years ago. And then in other places like down on the Alaska Peninsula, the Mulchatna herd has gone from several 100,000 down to just a few thousand. And other populations have changed, varied in their populations. And then the sea habitat changes. We're experiencing an incredible spruce bark beetle outbreak because of the warmer weather. And they're devastating the forest. There's places south of me for hundreds of square miles that all the spruce trees are dead. They attack some of the ground cover when they've killed all of the trees. So that's going to have a profound effect on the wildlife resources, which is my main interest. And, over time, you see that if you come here, like I live right near Denali Park. If I look out my window here, I see the park. And people come here, the first time ever, and they're pretty amazed with what they see. And then for me, I look at it and remember what it used to be like.
Wow.
And see how it's changed.
What is what has been your understanding of why caribou populations have fluctuated so much? Just a combination of habitat reduction and overharvesting, or
in cases in the past, years ago in the 70s, there was some extreme overharvest that affected the Western Arctic herd. But more recently, a lot of the things are very we have very limited knowledge of. And a lot of people think that it has more to do with global climate change than anything else. But one good example of that would be here in Denali. This park originally was Mount McKinley National Park, and it was established to protect all sheep. And those mountain sheep, the only all white sheep in the world, at some point or other were estimated to be around 7,500 animals. And then they declined over a number of years, and now there's less than 2,000. And there are researchers looking at the encroachment of brush and woody plants into the alpine where the sheep normally live. And those are not the plants they've uh, relied on for eons to survive. So the habitat is changing, and that has affected the. And then a lot of snow and ice too in the wintertime really affects sheep.
This is a bit off topic, but still on your past and Alaska. You wrote a book titled "Building the Alaska Log Cabin."
Yeah, log home, huh?
Yeah. How many log cabins does one build, Tom, before they are inspired to write a book about building log cabins? I mean, I'm really fascinated by the history of homesteading in Alaska, and I mean the log cabin, of course. But what's your history and relationship to the log cabin?
Well, the better question would be how many log cabins do you have to build before your body gives up on you and you can't
And
do
then
it
you have
anymore?
to write it.
And the answer is 35.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And how did you build those?
My goodness.
What tools did you use to build log cabins? Was it? I mean, I know people used horses and all sorts of things to.
No, we don't have horses so much up here to use for those purposes. But I got we in Alaska there was this program called Open the Entry, which was a mini homesteading act run by the state where you could get 5 acres or more to live on. And we went out in the bush and we built by hand a log house. That was the first one. And then I'd worked with a friend of mine who was a contractor who built log houses for other people. And then I just picked it up from there and did it on my own.
Man.
It was part of living close to the earth.
Yeah.
So I live here in a beautiful log home near Denali Park. And people, made comments about, boy, look at all these trees that got killed to build this house. But the reality was these huge logs, some of them 16 inches across, were cut for firewood. And I resurrected them. My friend Kim Blair, who still builds log cabins, we resurrected these from a log yard that they were being cut up to firewood. And I think this is a better use.
Yeah, of course.
And it's just interesting because you're so in it, Tom, in terms of, I mean, you were Alaska Historian of the Year. You were Alaskan Conservation Foundation's Hausberg Lifetime Achievement Award. Like you won these awards. It's just you live, breathe Alaska. You and like Steven said, you have such an incredible worldview of this place, and it's really thrown throughout the book. And I love that about what you did. Is we were talking about Wolf 258, the Wanderer, as you named him. But all the backstory about what Stephen asked about the caribou, about the ever-changing climate, all this stuff is so paramount to the story of Wolf 258's trek, and you do such a great job of that. I mean, what was the research like did you already have it? Was there, I know you gave acknowledgments at the end of the book, but just talk about just the research that had to be done or the extra, papers or files or anything else you had to go through to really make this story come to full scope for you.
Well, I think the reason why it worked, everybody else will have to determine whether it worked or not, but it worked for me was I heard the story originally from a friend of mine who started working on the Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve Wolf Project a long time ago. And he told me about this amazing wolf that went all of these miles. And a number of years went by. I was working on other things. And then finally, I made contact with his predecessor, his successor, and got the data, the GPS radio satellite tracking data. And at first, I was overwhelmed by it because it was this one big map with all these dots on it, and they were overlaying one another. It just looked like this mishmash. But when I would put the coordinates and dots into a program and remove them and looked at the area the wolf had gone, I realized that over the years I'd been camping there in some of those areas, floating rivers there, hiking there, hunting there, fishing there, or flown over all of that. And you could never do that in a short period of time. It would exhaust you in funds and places to go. And even some of the places he went in Canada, I'd been there. So then I went, well, I know this country really, really well. Not intimately each location, but I know it well enough to know what animals live in this drainage, what animals are on this river, where these animals go. So once I saw that I could parcel it out in the little segments of areas I was familiar with, it became much easier to work on. And I was able to use my own experience of what the weather would be like and what the mosquitoes would be like. And then I had to go and get the weather records from the U.S. Weather Service, the Canadian Weather Service, and check all the local weather spots along the way, over 3,000 miles if you look at his distance he traveled, and figure out what it was like on each of the days he was in those various areas, and then be able to describe the habitat, to know what animals were there. And then on top of that, I fed in the information of the migration route of the porcupine caribou herd, because so much of his movements were related to the movements of the porcupine caribou herd. So it all fit together like this giant puzzle, and I tried to make sense out of it and put it all together that way. And then other segments, for example, the movements of muskox on the North Slope and the comings and goings of other species, the migratory waterfowl. Fed all of that in and tried to make a big picture and try to capture a day-to-day movement of where the wolf was and what he was doing. And some of the dots, all you know is he was in that place. But when you look at the data points that are static, like he's in one place for 2 or 3 days, he's made a kill and he's feeding on it. So what would be there at that time of year? In some of the areas, obviously, the only thing that'd be there would be a sheep. In other places, the only thing that'd be there would be a caribou. And then in other places, the only thing that could be there would be a moose or a winter kill. And then the kind of the fascinating thing for me for the whole story was that he went through a segment of wilderness unparalleled in the United States. Huge tracts of public land that produces a lot of animals, a lot of wildlife, but yet he struggled to make his way and to survive through all of that. And I remember, I guess it was Rudyard Kipling that once wrote something like, the power of the wolf is the pack, and the power of the pack is the wolf. Mm-hmm. And you realize that a lone wolf is not as successful a hunter as a pack of wolves is. And that it's a disadvantage for an animal like that who's a disperser to go in search of prey by himself or herself. And when he left Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve, he had already lost one mate. And he was on his own, and he was looking for a maiden territory of his own.
Yeah. And biologists were 100% sure that he died of starvation?
Ultimately, yes. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of parts in the book and that you really catch the reader's attention. And just for those of you that are listening and that ultimately are going to pick up this book and read it, we're talking northeastern Alaska, really on the border of Canada and towards the Arctic Circle. So we're talking way up there, as Tom's describing, plethoras of these types of wildlife, bears, moose, all the big ungulates, caribou and stuff like that. And it's just fascinating to read in great detail from you, Tom, is about, like you say, the weather patterns, or if he's on there this day, this is what should be there. And we were just talking prior to recording that you're going to go see the ice breakups in the rivers. So just the treachery, the treacherous path that the Wanderer Wolf 258 took. It's just amazing the amount, like you say, 3,000 miles is just an incredible voyage for any one species or pack, but for one animal to do this and trek across is just phenomenal and engaging in a story form to be able to read this.
What also is interesting, let me paint this little picture for your listeners. The wolf was born and raised and grew up along the Yukon River in forest. And he leaves there on his own by crossing the Yukon River at breakup, goes into Canada, comes back into Alaska, and goes all the way north to within, he might have even gone to the edge of the Arctic Ocean. There's a data point that he was within a couple miles of the ocean, but we only know that's where the data point was recorded. He might have gone all the way to the edge of the Arctic Ocean. And think of it, he's on the edge of the Arctic ice where there's polar bears and Arctic foxes. Who would have thought a wolf would end up there? And this is all open tundra. The tallest plants right there, maybe 6-8 inches tall. He's come from a forest. He's gone all the way up there, and then he crosses a mountain range, the Brooks Range, to get there. And then he spends his summer on the North Slope of Alaska. It's just incredible to think about the journey an animal would make alone on foot like that. Especially with, the one remarkable thing about wolves is they're incredible. They have these incredible senses of scent and hearing and vision, but yet a disperser like this, a wolf that's going off looking for a mate in its own territory, is handicapped because it can't vocalize really. If it starts howling or responding to howling of other wolves, it's putting itself at great risk because the highest mortality of wolves is from other wolves. So if it responds to the howling of other wolves or howls to attract a wolf or a mate, it's putting itself at risk. So they have to be pretty silent. And then they scent mark. They come across other wolves' scent, and they scent mark to establish their presence, let other wolves know they're there. I kind of think that they don't do much of that when they're dispersing because, again, it puts them at risk. And I don't think there's ever been a single person ever that has seen two single dispersing wolves come together and pair up. I don't think that's ever been witnessed. I don't know how it could be witnessed. You might have radio collars on them or satellite collars on both of them, but you would still not be able to witness how they come together and how they determine they're not a threat to one another. So it's quite a process to be able to go off like that and find a mate.
Where did he stop the longest, or was he continuously moving, just not content enough to stop for long?
Well, that's a really good question because there's a little controversy about that. He went north, followed the porcupine caribou herd, went into Canada, came back, and then crossed the whole Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and hardly lingered because it was a late winter. There was a lot of ice and snow. The caribou weren't there. They stayed in the Yukon because there was a late migration and they didn't want to come over to where the snow and ice were deeper. So he ended up near Prudhoe Bay. He never crossed the Dalton Highway, which is the main road from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay. He stayed on a couple of high plateaus near Franklin Bluffs, and he spent most of the summer there. And John Birch believed that he probably had picked up a mate, and that's what was holding him there. The current biologist doesn't think so. He thinks it was all food related, that there were a number of caribou there from the Central Arctic caribou herd, and he was feeding on their calves. And so he found a place where there was food that he could catch, because that would be the perfect size for him. And he stayed there because of food. But we don't really know, because John Birch, the biologist, could not have afforded a flight all the way from Yukon Charlie all the way up there to get an aerial observation to determine whether he was alone or not.
And what's the, for you, because you've written you've written a lot of books, you were a wildlife tech and a wilderness guide too. How was this process different for you in that you could really hone all of your knowledge and your skills over the course of time that you've gathered and could implement them into this story? Because it really seems that, because of the way you're able to divert so seamlessly to the political scene in terms of making sure caribou herds are healthy enough for people to hunt, and then diving back into the weather and the landscape, because you've, like you said, you've camped some of it, you've walked some of it, you hiked some of it, and then learning about this wolf story and really weaving it all together. How did that feel for you in this particular process as opposed to, say, the other books that you've written?
Well, let me just take a little tangent here and say that the thing that fascinates me the most about wolves, and I've seen a lot of it over the years, is how they cooperatively hunt. I one time watched with a friend of mine this wolf stalking the edge of the road after the road had closed in Denali Park, stalking the edge of a road and using the edge of the road edge as cover. And he was stalking a little group of Dall sheep up on the mountainside, and they didn't see him. And he went along, and it was a male wolf. And he went along to a little gully. He got to the gully, snuck up the gully, and then he'd figured that out some way or other. But there was a little bit of a rise in the gully, and the sheep saw him because he was in the open, and they took off. And he just kind of stood there and watched him take off. His surprise attack was thwarted. But then the interesting part was, further up the mountain was yet another wolf laying in wait. And how did that wolf get up there, get in the place, hide without the sheep seeing it, and wait for his buddy to come up from below to have a pincher movement on those sheep? How do they communicate that is the interesting thing. And I've seen that several times. And so back to your question, people have asked me over the years, well, why don't you write a book about wolves? Especially after one summer, 4 summers in a row, I photographed and followed some maritime wolves on the Alaska Peninsula, and got some interesting observations and photos. But I said, I don't really want to write a wolf book because it's so hard to stay out of the weeds of politics with it. So what happened with this book was I focused on trying to be a journalist and be as objective to both sides of the issue as possible. And only time will tell, because the issue of wolves is so volatile that don't bother me with facts. I know what I know and they're no good, or don't bother me with facts. I know what I know and they're wonderful. There's no in between. But I tried real hard to be as objective as I possibly could, and that was the real challenge of it.
Can you tell us more about, you just mentioned John Birch. I was going to ask about him. What was his connection to this wolf and to you, to your story? He seems to be tied to it fundamentally. Was this just another project in his profession, or did he have a connection with this particular animal?
Well, John Birch came to Denali back in the 90s to do a wolf. He's a tremendous field biologist. And he came back he came to Alaska in the 90s from down in the States, where he'd been working with David Meach, Dr. David Meach, to do a Denali Park wolf research study. And I met him when he first came here. And he's one of those guys that, he's good. He's a good builder. He's a good outdoorsman. He's just multifaceted. So he started this project at Denali, took it somewhat to conclusion, although it's still ongoing, and then moved on to Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve as the wolf biologist there. And over the course of his career, he's handled, captured, he said recently, between 500 and 600 wolves. There's few people that have the field experience that he has, and he's retired now. He's living down in Nebraska, and he's a biologist, and he looks at animals with a biologist viewpoint. But I think for him, when he saw how far this wolf had traveled or discovered the distances and directions it went, it pretty much floored him as well as it did a layperson like myself.
Wow. Man, that's wild. Yeah, because you mentioned him a lot, Dr. Dave Meach, again, just because he's really the father or the grandfather of this, a lot of this wolf research. What was that impact like for you, just to talk about these two individuals and the way that they were, well, at least John was able to help you get all this information, and then, was it sort of like a passing of the torch of this animal to you to write this story? How did you feel taking that on?
Not so much. John's been pretty busy, and he's, like I say, he's down in Nebraska, but his successor at Yukon Charlie, Matt Sorum, was great. He helped me, and immeasurably, he gave me all of the data that he could, and he read the manuscript and made some comments. And I think Matt saw what I was trying to do as beneficial to his goal for his research and time at Yukon Charlie, was to just get the word out about how special a place it is and how amazing wolves are. And I'm not a biologist or wolf researcher in any way, but I felt like when I was done talking to the various biologists that I worked with, I had a little mini course in wolf biology from, well, can I say, the horse's mouth? Instead of reading in a book,
Yeah.
here were the real experts in the field telling me all about it.
Wow. Who initially named 258 the Wanderer? I think I saw it right up.
I did.
You did. Did you? Okay.
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to ask me that. I did, and some biologists, the principal guiding factor for biologists is they don't want people looking at individual
Right.
animals. They want us to look at
numbers, yeah,
the overall species, and some of them just absolutely loathe common names for animals. But it's interesting. Last summer and then again this summer, I'm going to be going out to McNeil River State Brown Bear Sanctuary to work for a while, and all of the bears are named, and that just crossed some biologists' sense of propriety, because they think they should not have names, because then people make attachments to them and add anthropomorphic qualities that don't exist, and they would much prefer just a simple number.
Yeah, I always ask the authors we interview how they feel about naming animals and that argument.
Well, my personal opinion is I've got a red squirrel that comes around my place all the time. I call him Reddy. I'm not going to give him a number.
Right.
And so, but I don't assign human qualities to him either.
Right.
And I see why biologists are a little wary of it because, some people will see a bear or something and, oh, that's Sparky. That's my friend Sparky. He's not your friend.
Yeah.
You don't make friends with animals. And I can see why they're very wary of that. But to make a connection with the reader had to be something more personal than Wolf 258.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you too, and what's interesting about this is this captured, it's obviously your interest, John's interest, Matt's interest, in terms of the biologist and the author. Was there any similarity to, say, like an OR6? OR6 was, nationally recognized. Everybody was, waiting for articles to come out, looking to see where the journey was taking him. It didn't seem as though Wolf 258 hit that, but I don't know what was the feeling like up there in the Yukon area, in Alaska and Canada, where were people monitoring this wolf, or was it just sort of flying under the radar and taking this journey sort of silently and under the radar, as I was saying before?
Well, the Oregon wolf that ended up in California broke some monumental historic boundaries. It had been 100 years or more since there'd been a wolf in California.
Right.
And I don't know how many years since one had denned. And Oregon doesn't have a lot of wolves. And, there's issues like livestock and, animal husbandry that spark a slightly different response to wolves than and much higher human population, so that people there want to clarify the danger from an animal like that they know nothing about. And in Alaska, we have a lot of wolves. There could be more, there could be less than what people think there are, but there sometimes you see them on the highway, crossing the highway. So it's not like it was that novel of a report for some Alaskans, but for me it was, and for anybody in the know it was, just because of the distance that he traveled.
How often do you see wolves in Alaska? You personally, I mean.
I haven't seen any this year. I saw some last year.
They're hard to see.
It's not like a Yellowstone. Well, I did see some in Yellowstone last winter, but it's not like a Yellowstone experience where there's people stationed along the road that are constantly following the wolves. But you'll see them now and again crossing the road, or if you're out hiking or in the backcountry, you'll maybe hear them. But it's novel enough that you'd never take it for granted. There, right around my area where I live, there's been a lot of wolves this winter. One of my neighbors, Nan Eagleson, was out for a hike below her house, and she saw something running through the timber, and she thought, wait, that's not my dog, because my dog's over there. And she looked further and went a little further, and she found a caribou kill. The wolves that killed a caribou not too far from her house. She thought, well, I think maybe I better head home, take my dog with me. And that was very close to her house, apparently. So they are in the neighborhood, and lots of times you don't know they're here.
What's it like? I know you really played the middle extremely well in this book. You didn't really, in terms of opinions about the political and the scientific factors about wolves and caribou. But what's the general feeling or overall feeling about the caribou herd, the healthiness of the caribou herds as opposed to the wolf population and the health of that? Is there a lot of back and forth that you've seen in the time you've been there? I'm sure there's been a ton of change, both in the populations and in public perception. Are people more accepting of wolves in terms of what they need to do to survive, as opposed to keeping the caribou herds alive for the indigenous populations or people that need them for food throughout. Is there a balance there?
No.
Or is there kind of a back and forth? No. Okay. That's an easy answer.
Absolutely not. As I said, the mentality is don't bother me with facts. I know what I know. And I don't think there's ever any way to achieve a middle ground, a good middle ground for any of it. Even the biologists, they that work with caribou and work with wolves are constrained by politics. And, many of the biologists that were involved, or some of the biologists that were involved in studies of caribou and the wolf control that went on up near Yukon, Charlie, they would rather not do that, but they have to do it because of politics and because of the law. And a couple of biologists that have since left the Department of Fish and Game have come right out and said that wolf control is a farce. It doesn't work. It doesn't affect but the caribou that in the way that people think it is. And there was just a report this winter about how I don't remember all of the details of it, but there was a report that the state has spent umpteen millions of dollars killing wolves and bears to promote caribou and moose numbers, but it wasn't working. And yet the higher ups in Fish and Game says, we don't care, we're going to continue to do it anyway. And people were saying, yeah, but this report says it's pointless and it doesn't work. Well, those guys that make those decisions are political appointees, and they follow what they see as some bigger picture, I suppose.
Yeah, because when you describe it in the book, and you do, as I said, you do a great job of laying out, it's not just one factor that affects any herd or any animal or any pack. Obviously, the climate is clearly shifting in a direction that is pushing herds to different places. When you're reading about 258's journey, the Wanderer's journey, he's going to places that you yourself, and I'm sure, Matt and John were even saying to you, why would he go to some of these far-reaching places? Why would he go towards the Arctic Circle? Why would he go across these breakup places? So clearly there's multiple reasons why herds are dropping or growing, shifting and moving. Packs do the same thing. And again, I want to commend you for just you really lay it all out, and obviously you have the knowledge for it. So does it strike you? I'm sure it's frustrating in a sense, but for you, I mean, where do you fall on that? Just that it's just the way it is, and we just sort of have to see how the soil is going to play out over the course of time, or is there anything that you take with it after writing this book?
Well, it's a complicated factor complicated situation, because for many people on either side of the wolf issue, it comes down to people, what we do. But where we live in northern Alaska, and I would say probably the same in Canada, there's so many other factors that are going to be involved in all of this. And, we have, I've talked to a lot of tourists, because I'm here near Denali Park, who say, oh, I'm surprised we've seen so few animals. And, in California, we'd have gone that far, we'd have seen 50 deer. Well, for as much land as here, we have very few large mammals, relatively few large mammals. And that's because of the winter weather. That the northern species are only going to prosper as long as the weather allows them to. So yes, people can take caribou and they can take wolves and may or may not have an impact the way they do it, but the overriding factor is the weather. Now then you add to that global climate change, where there's deeper snow, where there used to not be so much snow, which impacts the caribou, which impacts their ability to find food. you have icing conditions in the middle of the winter, and that impacts mountain sheep. There's going to be winners and losers. And some of these species, regardless of how we think we're going to manage them, I just kind of laughed at that because when I was in college, we were told wildlife management is not really wildlife management, it's people management. You're managing people. But anyway, we think we can manage them, but the animals are being managed by the weather and by changing conditions. And that's something we have no control over.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, at least lately, actually arriving at some kind of amicable place between belief systems on this topic. It seems just more and more complex as you continue to explore it. I mean, why continue to try and to write about this subject? I mean, do you consider yourself a writer who is trying to inspire your readers to some kind of shift in thought, or are you just simply writing to share a story that's been compelling to you?
Both. I once told, I was once, I don't know if this is, I think if you talk to other writers, you've heard the same thing, but there's like zero money in writing. You spend hours and days in your basement staring at the wall and you're writing, and oh, today I made 2.5 cents an hour, so I'm really doing well. That kind of thing. But so I was bitching about that one day, and somebody said, "What? Well, why do you do it?" And I go, I was influenced as a kid by writers. In fact, I'm rereading Lois Chrysler's great book, Arctic Wild. And I read that when I was 12 or 14 years old, and it really influenced me. And if anything I ever wrote would impact for a positive way of some young person, I would feel like it's been a success. And hopefully give them a better idea of what it's all about than wolves bad, wolves good. To see the complexity of the situation.
Yeah. You just said that book. Who have been your influences over time that have stood out for you?
Oh gosh, Lois Chrysler's book was very influential. I don't know if you've ever heard of Charles Sheldon. He wrote a book about, it was called The Wilderness of Denali, and he was the promoter of establishing this place as a national park. He was a hunter. He was an early conservationist, and in those days they collected specimens. So he was a hunter, friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. Teddy Roosevelt, I read a lot of Teddy Roosevelt when I was a kid. Of course, Lewis and Clark. Bernard DeVoto wrote a great book about bears. Just a lot of and of course, the one phenomenal book that I always go back to is Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac.
One of the best.
And then Adolf or Ade Murray and Olaus Murray, their books, all of those had an impact.
Yeah. Any Mountain Man books? Were you into any Mountain Man stories?
Oh gosh, I read almost all of those. There was the Sandos, Maria Sandos and Jules Sandos. That's where the historian streak in me comes from, I think. They wrote books about the mountain men and the westward expansion, and I was reading those when I was 10 and 12 years old.
What is it? I don't know if I've asked any of the other authors we've had who've referenced this, but what is it for you, Tom, about Aldo Leopold specifically in the Sand County Almanac that resonates so much? I know people quote the wolf quote or the wolf on the mountain quote and things like that. What's the thing for you that stuck, that really got you to resonate with that so much?
So I'm old enough now that I got some education from the old timers, some of the first people to teach wildlife management and wildlife biology. And there's one thing that sticks with me. One thing that was said once by a professor, and he said, any wild animal that dies a natural death or dies of old age is wasted. And that's what he was telling his students. And I remember that stopping me in mid stride and just listening to that and thinking, really, they have no intrinsic value other than to be harvested by people or used by people. They die of old age, they're wasted. And that was part of the paradigm of wildlife management and curriculum in that era. So then I discovered Aldo Leopold and read his book. Another one was Sigurd Olson's books of the North Woods. They had an entirely different take on it, had a more thoughtful take on it. And that was the value of that, was seeing another way to look at it and finding a more nuanced view of our relationship to animals.
He describes or lives in these miniature worlds, these tiny yet important signs of life, waking up before the sun with a coffee and his dog, documenting a chronological order of bird calls, and things like that. It just reminds you how fascinating the natural world is beyond what you can obviously see in a big meadow or in big country. It's Sand County Almanac is one of the best reads.
So I agree with that. And one of the interesting things was a couple of summers ago, I was on a hike with a young man who's a naturalist out at Camp Denali here in the park, and here we are surrounded by caribou, and there might be wolves and there might be bears and there's Dall sheep and everything. And he gets his group of people on their hands and knees to look at mushrooms and starts telling them about the mycorrhizas that connect all of those mushrooms. And I thought, boy, have times changed. Not everybody's, but just having that broader perspective was pretty wonderful.
Yeah, and the way he just follows a small mammal track under branches and through snow, it really inspires you to do the same and to explore those miniature worlds. I find myself summoning that sentiment every time I'm out, and since reading the book, and rather than crushing miles to a tall peak and a view, I more often find myself following a grouse track for a long time or something.
Yeah, I mean, for you, Tom, and I know you said it, if they could influence or change an individual or a group of individuals, that would be great. But what do you want someone who picks up the Wanderer to, what's your intention for them to take away? What's for somebody who's going to read this? And I encourage everybody to read it. If you're a wolf person, an environmentalist, or somebody who really wants to learn about the ecological effects of what's happening, Tom, like I said, does a great job. So for you, what's something that you're looking, that you hope gets across to the reader or the listener if it's an audio form?
I'll back up a little bit to something we already said. Is this wolf traversed unparalleled wilderness, even by Alaskan standards. Northeast Alaska is unparalleled wilderness with very little development of any kind except for a few native villages. And there's a lot of wildlife out there. There's moose, there's grizzly bears, there's black bears, there's caribou, there's mountain sheep, there's small animals of all kinds. And this animal took off into it. And of course, you can't have really healthy wolf populations without healthy wild lands. And yet, he went up through all of that and traversed a mountain range, the North Slope, almost made it in a circle back to Yukon Charlie before he starved. Through all of that wild land and all of that wildlife, and he didn't make it. He didn't survive. People think animals just prance around out there. Oh, I'm hungry, I'll kill a caribou, or I'm hungry, I'll kill a sheep, or I'm hungry, I'll. It's not that simple. They lead extraordinarily difficult lives. All predators do, foxes or whatever. And if even the most hardened wolf hunter or trapper or whatever would read it and come away with an idea that, oh, these animals lead a pretty tenuous life, I think it would be beneficial. I think that would be the one outcome I would most be happy with. I think of a couple of quotes. Dave Meach once said that a wolf either dies of starvation or is killed by other wolves. I think that's totally accurate. And another biologist, Robert Whedon, once said something like, the world needs the embodiment of the frontier mythology, a place where wolves stalk the strand lines in the dark, because a land that can produce a wolf is a healthy and robust land. And that kind of says it all, because you're not going to have wolves unless you have wilderness or wild land.
Yeah, we agree. I mean, it's like I said, it's just the way that you traverse everything that's going on at the time, and this trek for the Wanderer, for Wolf 258, it's fascinating. It's incredible. And I really invite anybody who's listening to pick up a copy, to do that and really read this journey and go along for the ride that Tom has laid out for you all. My last question for you, Tom, before we get to where everybody can get the book, is, when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
To be honest, just what I said, wilderness. I see how some people, they see the wolf as the symbol of the wilderness, and it carries a lot of importance for that reason. But I think of it more in the reality that when I grew up as a kid in California, left there when I was 21, never to return, there weren't bears. There were, big bears. There weren't grizzly bears. There weren't wolves. And I always looked north to the wilderness where you could see intact wildlife populations. And I remember once in the Santa Monica Mountains, a friend of mine had discovered a big sandstone cave. And we went into the cave, and he said, "Look at that." And I was looking and I didn't see anything. And he said, "No, look up on the wall of the cave." And on the wall of the cave were these big scrape marks that looked like the claws of a bear had clawed this inside of that cave. The same marks I'd seen on trees up near Yosemite where black bears had scraped the tree. But those marks, to him and I, maybe we were wrong, but we saw grizzly bear scratchings. And so where do you find grizzly bears and where do you find wolves? In the wilderness.
Yeah, I love that. I love all that. So, Tom, you said it's available, so they can find the book. Again, for all of you that are listening, and we're actually going to have, for those of you that are listening, we have a giveaway coming again. So those of you stay tuned for the next couple of episodes where we're actually going to be giving away a copy of The Wanderer and Alaska Wolf's Final Journey by Tom Walker, published by Mountaineers Books. Tom, they can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and that's and anywhere else they can find books, correct?
Yeah, hopefully a lot of independent booksellers, because they breathe life into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you guys go to your local bookstores, look for The Wanderer, and then you guys again pick this up. It's a great read. It's a short read, and it's just fascinating. You'll want to read it again and again to go over stuff that you might have missed before. So, again, Tom Walker, love it. Thank you for spending time with Stephen and I. Just hang out for a minute when we sign off, but appreciate your time, your knowledge, and just this latest addition to your works.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, John and Stephen. Thank you very much for asking
Yeah,
me.
thank you, sir.
Of course. No problem. House to all of you out there, and we'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
See ya.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.